remember the day the ration seals changed because the wax cracked differently beneath my thumb. That was the first sign. Before the war ground us down to filings, the seals were clean, uniform things, pressed with the sigil of supply and countersigned by an officer whose name I never learned, but whose authority felt absolute. On that day, the seal fractured like old bone, the imprint blurred as if the stamp had been struck by a shaking hand. I stood in line with the others, boots sinking into mud mixed with ash, and stared at that broken wax longer than regulations allowed. The trooper behind me coughed, a wet sound that carried desperation, and the sergeant barked for silence. I broke the seal and said nothing. We were told it was an emergency measure. Everything was always an emergency. The war had eaten the roads, the skies, the manufactorums that once spat out tins of protein paste and nutrient wafers. The quartermasters spoke in rehearsed phrases about temporary logistical corrections and adaptive resourcing. Those words were stamped onto the requisition forms in red ink, the same red used to mark fatalities. I copied them into my own ledger with a dull pencil, careful to keep my handwriting neat. Neatness was devotion. Neatness was survival. The food inside the tin was wrong. I knew it the moment the steam hit my face, thick and oily, carrying a smell that didn't belong to any ration I had ever been issued. It wasn't rot. It wasn't chemical. It was rich, cloying, almost savory in a way that made my stomach lurch with equal parts hunger and revulsion. I remember thinking of shrine incense, of candle smoke melting fat from devotional offerings, and hating myself for the comparison. The paste had texture now, fibrous strands that resisted the spoon before giving way. I ate because I was ordered to eat. I ate because not eating would have been noted. Around me, the camp was quiet in that particular way that comes before screams. Men and women chewed slowly, eyes unfocused, as if listening for something only they could hear. The artillery on the horizon thudded at irregular intervals, each impact vibrating through the ground and into my teeth. A Vox speaker crackled overhead, looping a sermon about endurance and sacrifice, the voice distorted by static and distance. The body is a resource, the preacher intoned. Can all resources belong to the throne? I swallowed and felt the words lodge somewhere deeper than my throat. Questioning orders was a punishable indulgence. That phrase was drilled into us during induction, recited alongside the catechisms of obedience. Indulgence implied pleasure, and pleasure was suspect. To ask why the ration tasted different would have been to admit curiosity, and curiosity was the first step toward deviation. I had seen what happened to those who deviated. They were reassigned to labor details that did not return. Their names were struck from the rolls with a single line, as if they had never existed. I told myself the unease curling in my gut was just another weakness to be burned out by discipline. Still, I noticed things. I always noticed things. That was why I had been given a ledger instead of a rifle. The ration tins were heavier now. The serial numbers on the seals didn't match the entries in the supply index. When I brought this up, carefully, respectfully, the quartermaster smiled without showing his teeth and told me the index would be updated in due time. His breath smelled of grease and iron. I lowered my eyes and thanked him for his service. At night, the camp lights flickered, fed by generators that coughed and rattled like dying animals. I lay on my cot and listened to the sounds of consumption, spoons scraping metal, teeth working, someone retching softly before forcing themselves to continue. Hunger had always been part of my life in service, a familiar ache that sharpened focus. This was different. This hunger felt attentive, as if it were watching us from inside our own bodies, measuring, evaluating. I prayed, because prayer was mandatory, and because I didn't know what else to do. I recited the litany of sustenance, words learned by rote, asking for the strength to endure what was given. As I spoke, I became aware of a faint hum beneath the generators, a low vibration that seemed to come from the direction of the command levels. It wasn't machinery. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting, though I couldn't make out words. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself many things. The next morning, a corporal was flogged for refusing his ration. He was a big man, scarred and broad, someone I had assumed would outlast us all. He knelt in the mud, while the officer read out the charge: insubordination, waste of resources, spiritual contamination. Each lash landed with a wet sound that made my stomach twist. When it was over, they forced the tin into his shaking hands and watched until he ate. The lesson was clear. The food was not optional. Faith was obedience, and obedience was consumption. I wrote it all down that night, not in the official ledger but in the margins, tiny script hidden between columns of numbers. I didn't name my fear. I didn't need to. It was there in the way my pencil pressed too hard into the paper, tearing fibers. Something sacred was being quietly violated, not with fanfare or open blasphemy, but with stamps and signatures and sealed tins. That was the worst part. There was no enemy to fight, no clear line to hold, just orders written in hunger, and my own hand obeying them. I did not yet know what we were eating. I did not yet allow myself to know. Knowledge would come later, heavy and unavoidable. At that moment, all I knew was that the ration seals had changed, and with them, something inside me had begun to crack. I slept poorly, dreaming of ledgers that blurred when I opened them, of mouths opening in the dark, waiting to be fed. I learned to measure time by absence, not by sunrise. There was no true dawn beneath the bruise, colored skies and the perpetual haze of ash, but by what failed to arrive. The first absence was smaller crate of water, purification tabs that never made it to our sector. The second was harder to ignore, a shipment of medical gauze and antiseptic that the medicus swore had been signed for somewhere along the chain. Each absence produced paperwork. Each paperwork produced blame. Each blame fell downward, as gravity always does in the Imperium, until it settled on the backs of the starving and the bleeding. The supply vaults sat like a shrine to logistics at the heart of the camp, armored doors, cog-toothed locks, a constant halo of incense and machine oil. They were supposed to be inviolable. There were hymns about them, hymns not to the food itself, but to the sanctity of distribution, the holiness of correct allocation. I had copied those hymns into manifest margins more times than I could count. Yet now, when the doors rolled open, there was an echo inside that sounded like a coffin. I was assigned to the counting detail because my hands were steady and my eyes could be trusted with numbers. Trust, in our world, did not mean affection. It meant utility. It meant you were a component that had not yet failed. We filed in under the gaze of a servitor whose metal jaw clicked softly as it scanned our identification slates. The vault's interior was colder than the outside air, a refrigerated void designed to preserve rations against spoilage. The cold used to reassure me. Cold meant order. That morning it felt like accusation. Shelving units towered above us, labeled in crisp block letters, each bay corresponding to a category, and a subcategory and a code in the master index. The labels were all still there. The shelves beneath them were not. Inventory adjustment, the chief quartermaster said, voice flat. His eyes did not settle on any one person long enough to become personal. Record what remains. Do not speculate on what does not. Speculation was a sin in bureaucratic form. I swallowed it. I opened my ledger. I recorded the emptiness the way I recorded everything else as data. Bay 4 CD null. Bay 6 null. Bay 9A null. The pencil scratched like a rat in a wall. As we worked, I began to understand what the others had already felt in their bones. The vaults were emptying faster than the casualty lists could be updated. And the casualty lists updated quickly, too quickly. Every hour brought new names, new codes, new stamped confirmations of death. The dead were efficient. They didn't require rations. They didn't complain. They didn't file grievances. The living did. Out in the open, the lines grew longer. Starvation makes a crowd quieter, not louder. At first, hunger sharpens anger. Then it dulls everything until only the ache remains. Men who had shouted at officers now stared at their boots. Women who had once argued over billet assignments now watched the ration carts like animals watching a butcher's door. The camp smelled like sweat that never dried, like unwashed fabric, like the sour breath of people whose bodies were beginning to eat themselves. And then there were the officers. I noticed them most when I climbed to the command levels to deliver updated figures. The command section was elevated, built from stacked prefabricated plating, its walkways bolted together with rivets like rotten teeth. It was cleaner up there. That was the first insult. Clean floors meant someone had the leisure to scrub. Warm lights meant someone had power to spare. I walked through their corridors with my cap in my hands, shoulders hunched, aware of the mud I carried, aware of my smell. They averted their eyes when they passed the starving ranks below. Not always, but often enough to be a pattern. Their uniforms were newly pressed, creases sharp as knife edges, brass polished until it caught the weak light. It was as if they had agreed, silently, that presentation would replace provision, that an immaculate collar could absolve an empty stomach, but it was their mouths that made me look twice. Stains, sometimes. A dark smear at the corner of a lip, hastily wiped, a glisten on the teeth when someone spoke too close. I told myself it was recaf. I told myself it was ration grease. I told myself anything that would keep the shape of the world intact. The air up there was different too. Heavy. Thick with a smell that didn't belong in a command corridor, grease and cooked marrow, a lingering savory warmth like a kitchen after a feast. It clung to the back of my throat. It followed me out, down the stairs, and into my sleep. One afternoon, I waited outside the briefing chamber with my ledger pressed to my chest, the pages warm from my hands. Inside, voices rose and fell, commands, numbers, the cold cadence of resource allocation. I heard laughter. It startled me so much I nearly dropped the book. Laughter was rarer than ammunition. It sounded wrong in that place, like a hymn sung off key. Then I heard the scrape of cutlery against metal, unmistakable. The soft clink of utensils. The murmur of satisfied throats. My stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it felt like pain. Not for food, not only for food, but for fairness, for sense, for the reassurance that the machine we served still obeyed its own rules. A door opened. An officer stepped out, adjusting his gloves. He looked at me, and for a moment I thought he saw everything: the emptiness in the vaults, the lines of starving bodies, the tightening circle of fear. Then his gaze slipped away, as practiced as a drill. He took my ledger without touching my fingers, flipping through the pages with quick, precise motions. His nails were clean, too clean. "Your figures are inconsistent," he said, though I knew they were not. "Reconcile them. Present again at dusk." "Yes, sir," I replied, because there was nothing else I could be. The Imperium does not reward honesty, it rewards compliance. When he handed the ledger back, I caught it by instinct, and felt a faint warmth on the cover, as if his hands had been near a heat source. A scent rose from the leather binding, sharp and intimate cooked fat. My throat tightened. I did not look up. I could not afford to. Back among the ranks, whispers began to spread, thin as smoke. Not accusations. Accusations required courage, but fragments. "They've got stores. They're keeping it for themselves. They're eating better." A man beside me muttered that he'd seen a cart go up to command under a tarp, guarded as if it held relics. Another swore he'd smelled roasting somewhere near the officers' mess. I listened. I pretended not to. Listening, too, could be a crime if it looked like agreement. Survival still felt possible then, in a small and cowardly way. I told myself the shortages would break, that the next convoy would arrive, that some distant manufacturer would remember us. I told myself that if I stayed obedient, if my numbers stayed straight, if my reports were punctual, if my head remained bowed, then I would slip through the teeth of this grinding machine and come out the other side alive. And yet, each day, the vaults grew emptier. Each night, the command levels smelled more like a feast. The silence around the missing supplies became louder than artillery. No announcements, no punishment of the guilty, no sermons explaining the deprivation as holy trial. Just a bureaucratic void, an absence so complete it felt deliberate. That was when the suspicion began to take shape in my mind, slow and reluctant, like a corpse rising in cold water. I didn't name it. Naming would make it real. I didn't say it to anyone. Speech could kill you faster than bullets. But I began to dread the sound of cutlery in the command halls. I began to hate the sight of pressed uniforms. I began to fear the warmth behind sealed doors, because somewhere between the empty shelves and the stained mouths, a truth waited, patient, hungry, and inevitable. The new protein allotments arrived without ceremony, which in retrospect was their most honest feature. No announcements blared over the vox. No blessings were recited beyond the usual truncated catechism stamped on the requisition forms. They simply appeared on the distribution carts one morning, sealed in dull grey tins without identifying marks, beyond a single designation burned into the metal. Rahayam Biomaskiv. I wrote those words into the ledger with a hand that did not quite tremble. I was proud of that at the time. The phrase meant nothing and everything. Reclaimed could mean anything in the Imperium. Scrap metal pulled from a ruined manufactorum, water strained from corpse ash and re-sanctified, clothing boiled down and reissued. Biomass was a catch-all term, bureaucratic and mercifully vague. It allowed the mind to slide past uncomfortable specificity. I let it. The tins were warm when we received them. That alone should have told me more than I wanted to know. Rations were supposed to be shelf, stable, cold inert things. These radiated heat through my gloves, a lingering warmth like something that had been alive too recently. The quartermaster, overseeing the distribution, did not meet my eyes as he handed them over. He had begun to avoid eye contact entirely, as if the act of seeing might make him accountable. The sermon began as we ate. A Vox speaker crackled to life atop a rusted pole, its casing dented and blackened by shrapnel. The voice that poured from it was strained and distorted, stretched thin by distance and poor transmission, but the words were familiar. They always were. Sacrifice, duty, endurance, the sanctity of resource utilization, the holiness of necessity. The voice spoke of flesh as clay, of the body as currency spent in the emperor's service. It spoke of hunger as a test, and obedience as nourishment for the soul. I opened the tin. The smell was immediate and intimate, rising in a dense wave that made my eyes water. It was not the sterile chemical odor of processed paste. It was layered, fat, salt, something faintly sweet beneath it all. My stomach clenched, not in rejection, but in anticipation, and the shame of that reaction burned hotter than any heretical thought. I ate slowly, deliberately. I told myself that if I chewed long enough, if I focused on the act itself, I could avoid noticing details. Texture, however, is harder to ignore than flavor. The meat, because it was meat now undeniable, had grain. Fibers separated beneath my teeth, resisting just enough to demand effort. There were occasional softer sections, rich and almost buttery, and firmer bits that snapped unpleasantly when bitten. I prayed I would not encounter bone. Around me, reactions varied. Some soldiers wept openly, tears cutting clean lines through grime, streaked faces as they forced the food down. Their sobs were quiet, exhausted things, more reflex than protest. Others ate with ferocity, shoveling mouthfuls in as if afraid the ration might be taken away mid-bite. Hunger does not make philosophers, it makes animals. I saw men lick the inside of their tins when they were done, tongues darting like vermin. No one asked where the meat came from. That silence was not ignorance. It was agreement. The commanders were present for the meal, standing at the perimeter of the distribution area under the pretense of morale oversight. They watched us eat. Not with pity, not with hunger, with attention. Their eyes tracked movements, pauses, refusals. I realized, with a cold certainty, that this was not just feeding. It was an assessment. Those who hesitated too long were noted. Those who gagged were noted. Those who ate eagerly were noted too, though I could not tell whether that marked them for reward or suspicion. In the Imperium, enthusiasm can be as dangerous as dissent. I kept my expression neutral. I chewed, I swallowed. I did not look up. Later that day, I was summoned to update the supply ledgers. The command archive was a narrow chamber lined with data, slates and parchment stacks, the air thick with dust and incense. A pair of scribes worked in silence, their augmetic eyes clicking softly as they cross-referenced figures. I took my place at the assigned desk and began to log the new ration category. Reclaimed biomass, grade IV, source classified, yield variable, waste non-applicable. The words felt heavier than their ink. As I wrote, I became aware of a pattern emerging in the numbers. The protein output had increased sharply despite no corresponding increase in supply shipments. Casualty rates, meanwhile, had stabilized, not decreased, but plateaued in a way that suggested redirection. Losses were still occurring, but something was intercepting their consequences. I stopped writing for a moment, staring at the page until the ink blurred. A junior officer leaned over my shoulder, close enough that I could smell his breath. It carried the same rich, cooked scent that now haunted the command levels. "Accuracy is devotion," he murmured, not unkindly. "Do not let imagination interfere with your duty." "Yes, sir," I replied, and resumed my work. That night, sleep refused me. My stomach was full in a way it had not been for weeks, and my body responded with a traitorous sense of relief. Warmth spread through my limbs. Strength returned to muscles that had begun to waste. I hated my flesh for its gratitude. I lay on my cot listening to the camp breathe, to the distant thunder of guns, to the closer, softer sounds of people digesting. When dreams came, they were wrong. I dreamed of an endless table stretching across a cathedral-sized hall, its surface piled with indistinct shapes beneath cloths. Figures in officers' coats moved along it, carving with ritual precision. Each time a cloth was lifted, I woke before I could see what lay beneath. My mouth tasted of iron. In the days that followed, the ration continued. No one refused any more. Refusal requires a sense of alternative, and we had none. The sermons grew more explicit, leaning harder on scripture that framed consumption as communion. To take into oneself the flesh of sacrifice, the vox droned, is to share in its purpose. I wondered, not for the first time. How much scripture had been written to justify acts that should never have been named? I caught myself watching others as they ate, the way the commanders watched us, not with judgment but with fear, who recognized the taste, who avoided certain textures, who closed their eyes too tightly. I wondered what my own face revealed. The first crack in my faith widened. Faith, I had always been taught, was endurance without understanding. But endurance had limits, and understanding has a way of forcing itself through those limits when fed enough evidence. The meat had no origin because origins had been erased. Not destroyed, erased, catalogued out of existence, transformed into a line item that no longer required moral accounting. That realization settled into me like a sickness. I began to dread the distribution bell, even as my body yearned for its call. I began to resent the sermons, even as I mouthed their words. I began to fear the commanders not because they might starve us, but because they were watching to see how well we adapted to being fed this way. Because adaptation, in the Imperium, is proof of loyalty, and loyalty, I was starting to understand, had very little to do with righteousness. It had everything to do with how much you were willing to consume, without asking why. The next engagement ended at dawn. Though dawn is a generous word for the thin grey light that seeped through the smoke and dust. The guns fell silent not because the enemy was broken, but because there was nothing left to shoot at that still moved. The battlefield steamed as the heat bled out of ruptured machines and cooling bodies. I was sent with the recovery detail, not to fight, but to count. I had learned by then that counting was more dangerous than shooting. Normally, the dead were burned. There were rites for it, strict, inflexible rites. Bodies were lined in rows, names recited if known, numbers substituted if not. Incense was burned to mask the smell. Flames were lit, and the smoke was supposed to carry what remained of the soul upward, purified by fire and obedience. I had recorded dozens of such burnings. They were efficient. They were merciful, by Imperial standards. That morning, the rites did not occur. Instead, armed escorts arrived with sealed orders, their faces hidden behind rebreathers despite the air being no worse than usual. The dead were not aligned for burning. They were dragged, hauled by their limbs across the churned mud, leaving furrows that filled slowly with blood and rainwater. I watched a man I had spoken to the night before. His name had been Kars, I think, bounce lifelessly as he was pulled toward the rear lines. His eyes were open, glassy, staring at nothing. I told myself it was better not to look, and then hated myself for the thought. Processing reassignment. An officer announced when someone dared to ask. His tone suggested the matter was settled by its own inevitability. The fallen continue to serve. That phrase had been used before, usually in reference to memorials or recycled equipment. Hearing it applied so literally made my skin crawl. The medical bays were emptied within the hour. Stretchers and instruments were cleared out under the watchful gaze of the same officers who had once insisted on ritual purity. The red-stained tiles were scrubbed and re-marked with new symbols, logistical sigils, not healing ones. I was ordered inside shortly thereafter, ledger under my arm. My assignment appended in crisp script at the bottom of a data slate, assist with yield documentation. The air inside the repurposed bay was unbearable. Not the sharp stink of rot I had expected, but something worse, the thick, sweet smell of fresh butchery, warm blood, exposed fat, chemical preservatives sprayed too late to matter. The drains along the floor gurgled constantly, clogged with hair and fragments of bone that caught on the grates like offerings. Servitors moved methodically between tables, their augmetic limbs whirring and clicking, blades rising and falling with inhuman patience. The bodies were stripped of armor and identity with equal efficiency. Uniforms were cut away, tossed into bins marked for textile reclamation. Identification tags were removed and dropped into a separate container that chimed softly each time one fell in, like a mockery of a shrine bell. I saw faces I recognized. I did not allow myself to react. Reaction would have been noticed. An officer stood near the central table, overseeing the operation with a data slate in one hand and a strip of meat in the other. He ate as he spoke, chewing thoughtfully, as if considering a complex equation. "Ensure weights are accurate," he said, gesturing with the half-eaten piece. "West is inefficiency. Inefficiency is heresy." "Yes, sir," I replied, because the words came automatically now. I was assigned a station at the far end, where processed sections were weighed and categorized. Muscle mass, organ matter, secondary yield. I wrote the numbers down as they were called out, my pencil slick with sweat. Each figure corresponded to something that had once laughed, cursed, prayed. The ledger did not care. The ledger had never cared. As the hours passed, the officers' language shifted. At first, they spoke in euphemism, as if habit still restrained them. Reclamation, redistribution, emergency sustenance protocols. By midday, the pretense had thinned. I heard words like cuts and portions. I heard arguments about allocation, about which command cadre deserved priority. One officer quoted scripture, voice oily with satisfaction, about the shepherd who consumes the flock to survive the winter. The others nodded. There was no shame left in it. One of the scribes beside me retched quietly into a disposal chute and was dragged away by servitors without comment. His ledger was handed to another clerk within minutes. The work did not pause. It never paused. At one point, a familiar body was laid on the table before me. I recognized the scar on the forearm before I recognized the face. He had been a Vox operator, meticulous, always complaining about static. I had shared recaf with him once. His mouth was open, as if mid-sentence. I wrote his mass down to the last unit. My handwriting did not falter. That terrified me more than anything else. The justifications flowed freely now unchallenged. Efficiency, sustainability, holy recycling in service to the Imperium. Fire wasted what hunger could preserve. Burning was sentimental. Consumption was practical. The dead did not need their flesh. The living did. I began to understand the logic, and that understanding felt like corrosion. By the time the first processed allotments were sealed and sent upward toward the command levels, my clothes were soaked through with blood and sweat. My nostrils burned. My stomach twisted with a hunger I despised myself for feeling. When the officer overseeing my station clapped me on the shoulder, leaving a greasy handprint on my uniform, and told me I was doing good work, something inside me folded in on itself. That night, the ration tasted different again, fresher, hotter. There was no sermon this time, no need. The practice no longer required justification. It had become routine. I ate because my body demanded it, and because my mind had not yet found the strength to refuse. Every bite felt like a confession, not to a priest, but to the system itself. I was complicit. I had recorded the weights. I had ensured the yields were maximized. I had helped turn the fallen into sustenance. The ledger lay open beside me as I ate, pages speckled with dark stains that would never quite come out. I traced the columns with my finger, numbers blurring into one another until they lost meaning. In their place rose images I could not banish, drains clogged with hair, mouths chewing thoughtfully, officers quoting scripture with blood on their hands. I had crossed a line, not with rebellion, but with obedience. And obedience, I was learning, could carry you far past any boundary you would have sworn you'd never cross. By the time the commanders stopped hiding their appetites, I had already learned not to be surprised. The change was subtle at first, a loosening of restraint rather than an announcement. Doors that had once been sealed during meals were left ajar. Servitors began wheeling heated containers through command corridors in plain sight, their contents steaming faintly beneath cloths stamped with requisition codes. The smell, always the smell, became a constant presence, seeping down into the lower levels like a promise and a threat intertwined. Authority, I discovered, has a scent. The commanders grew heavier as the rest of us thinned. Not obese, such inefficiency would have been unseemly, but solid in a way that spoke of abundance. Their faces filled out, their eyes brightened. Hunger sharpened them, and then feeding made them bold. They spoke more, laughed more, argued openly in spaces where once they had maintained rigid decorum. Power does not merely corrupt. It indulges when it senses it will not be challenged. I was present during one such argument. It took place in a requisition chamber adjacent to the archive, a room designed for the cold negotiation of numbers. Two senior officers stood over a spread of data, slates, their voices low but heated. They were discussing allocation priorities for the next processing cycle. Not ammunition, not fuel, but flesh. The vanguard has taken losses, one said, tapping a slate with a finger that glistened faintly. They require incentive. Increase their portions. They are expendable. The other replied, tone clipped, command continuity is paramount. We cannot risk cognitive degradation due to inadequate nutrition. I stood at the edge of the room, ledger in hand, pretending to be invisible. My task was to record the final decision, whatever it might be. Neither man acknowledged me as a person. I was a function, a recording device made of meat. They compromised, as all bureaucrats do. A marginal increase for the front line, a larger one for command. The decision was logged, sealed, and justified under operational efficiency. As they spoke, a servitor approached with a tray. The argument paused while both men selected cuts with the casual entitlement of nobles at a banquet. Grease shone on their lips as they resumed, mouths full, voices unbroken. I wrote every word. The chain of command tightened after that. Orders came faster, with less explanation. Disobedience was no longer merely punished. It was consumed. The threat no longer needed to be stated. Everyone knew where refusal led. The very concept of dissent began to feel absurd, like arguing with gravity. I watched commanders issue orders that sent entire companies into unwinnable engagements, their voices steady as they signed the deployment forms. The casualty projections were clear. The losses were intentional. More dead meant more yield. More yield meant more power concentrated at the top. It was a closed system, elegant in its cruelty. Even obedience tasted of ash now. Every action fed the machine. Filing a report ensured the processing schedule ran smoothly. Escorting bodies guaranteed quality control. Eating the ration validated the doctrine. There was no neutral act left. To exist within the system was to contribute to its appetite. I felt it in my own body. The food made me stronger, more alert. My hands stopped shaking when I wrote. My steps grew surer. Hunger receded, replaced by a constant, low satisfaction that horrified me more than starvation ever had. My flesh was thriving on the same practice my conscience rejected. I began to understand why resistance was so rare. The body is a traitor when fed. One evening, I was summoned to a private briefing. Private, in this context, meant fewer witnesses. The room was small, lit by a single lumen strip that flickered intermittently. 3 commanders were present, seated comfortably, their uniforms immaculate. A table between them held the remains of a meal, bones stacked neatly, stripped clean. They gestured for me to stand before them, ledger open. "You've seen the numbers," one said. "You understand the trajectory." "Yes, sir," I replied. "Then you understand that scarcity is a tool." Another continued. "Hunger motivates, fear stabilizes, consumption consolidates." They watched me closely as they spoke, searching my face for signs of discomfort. I gave them none. I had learned better. "The chain must be preserved," the first said. "Those at the top must be strong enough to make the necessary decisions. That strength requires sustenance." He leaned forward. I could smell him clearly now. "Cooked meat, incense, authority. You have been useful," he said, "and discreet. Discretion was survival." I nodded. They dismissed me without ceremony. As I left, one of them called after me, almost conversationally, "Remember this, the Imperium does not reward purity. It rewards results." That sentence followed me for days. I saw the results everywhere. Increased operational tempo, Fewer disciplinary incidents, not because morale had improved, but because fear had been perfected. Soldiers moved with mechanical precision, their eyes hollow, their bodies fueled by something they no longer questioned. The sermons shifted again, praising decisiveness, strength, the virtue of those willing to do what others could not. The commanders began to speak of themselves as custodians of necessity, of burden, of sacrifice. They framed their indulgence as martyrdom, their feasts as grim obligations undertaken for the greater good. And perhaps, in their own minds, they believed it. Self-deception is the most stable foundation for tyranny. I realized then that there would be no end, not to the practice, not to the hunger, not to the consumption. Even if the war were won, an increasingly abstract concept, the system would persist. It had found a way to sustain itself using the very people it governed. Victory would only reduce external pressure, not internal appetite. The realization settled over me like a shroud. I had once believed that endurance would see me through, that obedience would be enough. Now I understood that obedience was the fuel, not the shield. The more faithfully I served, the deeper I sank into complicity. There was no safe distance, no neutral ground. The commanders ate. The machine turned. And I, with my ledger and my quiet compliance, helped ensure it never went hungry. They reassigned me to the archives when my hands grew too steady. That was how it was explained anyway, an administrative realignment recognizing my aptitude for reconciliation and long-term data integrity. The phrase was stamped onto the transfer order in blue ink, a color reserved for matters deemed irreversible. I was no longer needed near the processing halls or the ration lines. My work had moved beyond the physical. I was to account for the truth in its most abstract and dangerous form, numbers that could not be argued with. The archive was buried deep beneath the command levels, shielded from bombardment and, ostensibly, from contamination. Thick doors sealed with layered codes separated it from the rest of the camp. Inside, the air was dry and cold, preserved by ancient climate systems that hummed like sleeping beasts. Rows of shelves stretched into shadow laden with parchment, data, slates, and bound volumes whose spines bore centuries of accumulated guilt. This was where wars were remembered, not as screams or fire, but as ratios. My task was simple in description and monstrous in implication: reconcile casualty rolls against ration outputs over time, cross-reference personnel losses with biomass yields, identify discrepancies, ensure sustainability. That word again. I worked alone for the most part, accompanied only by the soft ticking of chronometers and the distant vibration of generators. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by the scratch of my quill and the occasional click of a servitor turning a page with mechanical reverence. Here, no one pretended not to know. The archive was where pretense went to die. The math did not lie. At first I approached it clinically, as I had been trained. Columns aligned, figures checked and rechecked. I corrected minor errors where clerks had miscounted yields or misfiled death codes. The system was vast, and like all vast systems, it relied on people like me to keep its lies consistent. But patterns emerged no matter how carefully I avoided seeing them. Consumption rates were rising faster than combat fatalities alone could explain. Command-level intake had increased disproportionately, even accounting for hierarchical allowances. More troubling still, there were intervals, quiet ones, where yields spiked without any corresponding battle, raid, or mass casualty event. I stared at those gaps for a long time. Eventually I traced them to disciplinary actions, a category broad enough to hide anything. Executions, reassignments, corrections, processing of non-combatants. The dead were no longer merely the cost of war. They were an internally managed resource stream. We were being consumed faster than the enemy could kill us. I wrote that sentence once, very small, in the margin of a working draft. I erased it immediately, heart pounding as if the page itself might report me. But the thought did not erase so easily. It echoed through my head as I worked, growing louder with each calculation. At night, if one could call the artificial cycle of dimming lights and reduced activity, night, I remained in the archive, unable to bring myself to return to my quarters. The scratching of quills followed me even when I tried to rest, a phantom sound like gnawing teeth. I dreamed of ledgers that blurred when opened, of numbers rearranging themselves into screaming faces. I considered my options. Sabotage was the first temptation. Alter the numbers. Underreport yields. Inflate casualties to force scrutiny. But the system was redundant by design. Every figure I touched existed in 3 other places, verified by servitors that did not sleep or doubt. Any discrepancy would be flagged, traced, and corrected. And correction, I knew now, did not mean amendment. It meant removal. Confession followed as a thought. Appeal to the ecclesiarchy, request a review. But doctrine had already spoken. The scripture was on the commander's side, and scripture was infinitely flexible in the hands of those who controlled its interpretation. To confess would not expose a crime, it would admit misunderstanding. Martyrdom was the last refuge. Refusal opened dissent. A final, futile gesture to assert that something was wrong. I imagined myself standing in a ration line, knocking the tin from my hands, declaring the practice heretical. I imagined the momentary shock, the swift response, the reassignment order stamped before my body even cooled. The system did not punish cannibalism, it rewarded it. That was the revelation that hollowed me out. Those who complied were fed, promoted, trusted. Those who adapted were elevated. Those who showed initiative, suggesting efficiency improvements, preservation techniques, allocation optimizations, were praised as visionaries. The machine selected for the very traits that ensured its continuation. Moral resistance was not merely crushed, it was rendered irrelevant. I kept working. Day after day, I reconciled the numbers, each completed ledger another brick in a structure that would outlast us all. I began to feel like a priest of some obscene faith, my rituals performed in silence, my prayers written in arithmetic. Each total I confirmed was a benediction, each signature an absolution. Sometimes, a name would catch my eye, a trooper I had spoken with, a clerk who used to hum while working, a corporal who had once shared a joke during a lull in shelling. Their names appeared briefly in the casualty rolls, then vanished into aggregate figures. Reduced. Sanitized. Forgotten. I wondered how long it would be before my own name followed the same path. The thought no longer frightened me as it should have. There was a strange comfort in inevitability. The Imperium excelled at removing uncertainty. Once you understood that everything was consumable, including yourself, the anxiety of resistance faded. All that remained was timing. One evening, a senior archivist visited my station. He was an old man, his body sustained by augmetics and ration privileges long since normalized. He looked at my work with approval, nodding slowly. "You see it now," he said, not as a question. I did not respond. He leaned closer, voice dropping. "This is how the Imperium survives," he continued. "Not through purity, through accounting, through knowing exactly how much can be taken without collapse. And when collapse comes," I asked, surprising myself with the sound of my own voice. He smiled, thin and tired. "Then we will account for that too." After he left, I closed the ledger and sat in the silence for a long time. My reflection stared back at me from the polished surface of the desk, eyes sunken, face gaunt despite the nourishment my body continued to receive. I looked like someone already half consumed. I realized then that my fate had already been written, not in prophecy, not in judgment, in inventory. I was a function that would eventually become redundant, a mind that knew too much and produced nothing but confirmation. When the balance tipped, when efficiency demanded it, I would be reclassified like any other asset. The ledger would note the change. The system would continue, and there would be no error to correct. My name appeared on the ledger on a day indistinguishable from any other. That was the cruel elegance of it. No alarms, no summons blaring through Vox speakers, no dramatic arrest or whispered warning. I was halfway through reconciling a quarterly yield summary when I noticed a new entry in the personnel index, inserted cleanly, efficiently, in the same hand that had recorded thousands of others. Status reclassification surplus, function redundancy confirmed, resource reassignment authorized. I stared at the words for a long time, waiting for panic to arrive. It did not. Instead, I felt something like relief, a loosening, the end of anticipation. I had known this moment was coming the way one knows winter will arrive eventually, not by prophecy, but by pattern. The numbers had been narrowing for months. Automation had crept into my duties. Servitors now cross-checked ledgers I once reconciled alone. Younger clerks were being trained in the same quiet efficiency that had marked me for usefulness and ultimately replacement. The Imperium does not hate you when it kills you. It simply finishes with you. I closed the ledger carefully, aligning it with the others on the shelf. Habit to the end. I straightened my uniform, smoothing creases that no longer mattered. When the escort arrived, 2 armed troopers and a servitor with a blank, metal face, I did not resist. Resistance would have been inefficient. They did not bind my hands. That courtesy surprised me until I understood it. I was not a prisoner. I was cargo. We walked through corridors I knew intimately, though I had never walked them this way before. Past the archive doors, past the requisition chambers, past the sealed elevators that led upward toward command and downward toward processing. Each threshold carried its own smell, its own temperature shift, its own memory. I realized I could trace my entire service through my senses alone. The lower corridors were warmer, more humid. The air grew thick with steam and antiseptic. The hum of machinery deepened into a constant vibration that settled into my bones. I recognized it immediately, the sound of production, of conversion. No one spoke. There was no need for final words, no demand for confession or repentance. The Imperium had already extracted everything useful from me, my labor, my compliance, my silence. Even now I did not scream. Silence, after all, was what I had practiced my entire life. We passed the processing halls. I saw them more clearly now than I ever had before, not as places of horror, but as the logical terminus of everything I had helped build. Stainless tables gleamed under harsh lumen lights. Drains ran clean ready. Servitors waited in idle configurations, blades folded, augmetics humming softly. The efficiency of it was almost beautiful, in the way a perfectly balanced equation can be. The irony was not lost on me. I had documented these corridors, measured throughput, optimized schedules. I had ensured the system ran smoothly enough to one day include me without disruption. That knowledge should have filled me with despair. Instead, it filled me with a bitter, exhausted clarity. This was always the ending. The Imperium does not collapse inward in a single catastrophic moment. It tightens, it refines, it consumes the unnecessary to preserve the structure. Heroes die loudly on battlefields. Clerks die quietly in corridors like this, their value calculated to the last usable unit. They sat me on the edge of a table and instructed me to remove my uniform. I did so neatly, folding the fabric as I had folded everything else in my life. It would be reclaimed. Reissued. Nothing wasted. The servitor took it from my hands with mechanical reverence, as if accepting a sacred offering. For a moment, just one, I considered speaking. Not to beg, not to accuse. Simply to name what was happening, to give it the dignity of truth. But truth, I had learned, holds no power unless it aligns with policy. My silence was more appropriate, more correct. As the restraints closed around my limbs, I felt no fear, only understanding. I thought of the ration tins, the sermons, the ledgers filled with bloodless numbers. I thought of how easily I had adapted, how willingly I had accepted each step, so long as it was presented as necessary. I wondered how many others had stood where I now stood, feeling the same grim acceptance. Probably most of them. The blade descended, not hurried, not cruel, just precise. I felt the cold first, then pressure, then nothing where something had been. My last sensation was warmth, spreading outward, my body already betraying me by giving itself over so readily. As consciousness faded, a final thought surfaced, clear and undeniable. The Imperium does not merely consume its enemies, it devours its own, slowly, bureaucratically, with hymns on its lips and ledgers in its hands, and it calls this loyalty.